David. I've just shared my screen now, so hopefully everyone can see the PowerPoint on the welcome slide. So yeah, thank you very much. It's lovely to be with you tonight and to spend a bit of time talking to you about COP, but also to hear some of your ideas and suggestions for what we can do. I work currently for Christian Aid Scotland. I've been there for about 5 years as the Campaigns and Advocacy Coordinator. So that involves working with colleagues across the UK. We design campaigns for supporters and campaigners to take part in, to lobby and to kind of make action for change. Part of that role involves translating some of those campaigns for a Scottish audience. So very aware that we have a different political and kind of social context in Scotland, and we adapt some of our campaigns for that as well. And I'm sure many of you have been involved in some of the work that Christian Aid does. I also, through Christian Aid, I do some work with Stop Climate Chaos Scotland, and I'll talk a bit more about them later. But I chair their public campaigns group, and that's one of 3 working groups we have. And this group essentially translates our policy and advocacy asks for a public audience. So we design kind of hopefully fun and more interactive and engaging ways for people to take action on climate in Scotland and to push for change through the Scottish Government. For example, over the last 3 to 4 years, we worked on the climate change bill that was passed towards the end of 2019. So we designed a whole range of activities. We had mass lobbies of the Scottish Parliament. We organised rallies outside the Parliament. We encouraged people to meet and to take e-actions to their MSPs. So really varied area of work, which is really good fun, and it's great to be able to work directly with people like yourselves in churches and in communities around Scotland, and to engage people who are really passionate about climate justice and about climate change and work to kind of mitigate that. A little bit more background about myself. I'm also an elder at a church in Edinburgh, Carricknow Church of Scotland. And your comment, David, about the eco baton reminded me that we also had the baton at our church, and myself and a number of others. We actually ran a section of the John Muir Way, which passes through our parish, with the eco baton, just to do something a bit different. And that was, yeah, a really good memory of that. I also worked for the Church of Scotland for a number of years, where David was as well. I was in the Church and Society Council. Similarly to this role now, it's about engaging churches in campaigns and action on the broad range of social justice areas that the church works on. Towards the end of 2019, myself and a number of others from SCCS, I think there were about 8 of us in total, we travelled to Madrid for COP25, and that was mainly once we became aware that COP was going to be happening in Scotland. We felt it was really important that those of us working on the issues in Scotland were aware of how COP works, but also to kind of do a kind of civil society handover, so to see how civil society groups in Madrid had been organising in the lead up to COP, and to kind of bring that onto Scotland and to start to engage people there. So that was a really helpful way to find out about COP and how it works, and I'll talk a bit more about that later. So tonight is really a chance just to share a bit about COP, about what it is, what it does, what it is trying to achieve, and also more detail on what's happening in Scotland and the UK globally in the lead up to COP, and how you can get involved as well. Going to try to move along the slide. Okay, that should work hopefully. So some of these details you might know already, but just to do a brief overview. COP stands for Conference of Parties, and this is essentially the body responsible for making sure that what's called the UNFCCC, which is a bit of a mouthful, is enacted. So basically it's the process for ensuring that climate change commitments made by countries are met. And the word parties in the Conference of Parties stands for the 197 nations and territories that have signed the convention. And COP has been meeting annually since 1995. So the COP number refers to the number of COPs that have taken place. So hence COP26 is the 26th COP, and that's the one that will be happening in Glasgow. And as David mentioned, you'll probably have heard of the COP, the Paris COP, which is number 21, and that is very well known because of its outcome. So that was the first international climate agreement, and where the actions and commitments that were taken collectively by the countries would ensure that temperature rises would be kept to no more than 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels, with an ambition to achieve 1.5 degrees. So that was why Paris was so significant, and why there was lots of positive reaction to the commitments that were made there. Now, this next slide that I'm going to show you, please do not be overwhelmed. This is a diagram by Jamie Livingston, who's the head of Oxfam in Scotland. And he is the chair of the SCCS, Stop Climate Chaos Scotland's COP steering group. And that was put together to coordinate all of our work around COP. And I'm just going to get the final few things up. Okay, that should be it. So a very intense, overwhelming diagram, and please don't worry about any of the detail, but this is to show you that COP is really complicated, but also that if you look at the grey circle where it says UNFCCC, with the blue zone and the green zone, these are the spaces where the official talks happen. So this is where the official UN delegations, the governments and countries who are part of the talks, this is the space that they are in. And Glasgow is going to be at the Scottish Exhibition Centre. Everything else is also connected to COP, but it's not in an official space. And this is where civil society and other groups get together, and they put pressure on the decision makers in COP and on other governments, for example. So it's not just within the official space that COP exists. There's a whole range of ways that you can engage with COP before COP and also during COP. And this map has essentially mapped out the different ways that Stop Climate Chaos Scotland wants to be able to engage and influence COP over the next year. I wanted to just talk a little bit about the context that we're operating in, because obviously when we first expected COP to be in Scotland, it was meant to be at the end of last year in 2020, and it's been moved by a year, understandably, because of the global pandemic. But this slide talks about theories of movements, and when I say movements, I mean, for example, the climate movements. And it talks a bit about their kind of momentum and impact. And I think it's really important to think about the climate movement and COP in relation to this, and in relation to the global pandemic. And what this diagram shows really is that when there is a crisis, so for example the climate crisis, we get growing public anger, and we saw that with for example the emergence of Extinction Rebellion, the school strikes. It really brought climate change into a kind of, to have a greater public awareness of it. And we noticed that within our work. So whereas before we had quite a small number of campaigners engaged on climate, it was kind of a bit of a niche interest. It suddenly became much more mainstream. But what we also see is them being affected by external happenings. So for example, the pandemic. And this is where on this diagram it talks about disillusionment or contraction. And that's not to say that the climate crisis has gone away or that people aren't passionate about working for climate justice. It's more to say that people's attention and energies have been directed, understandably, by the pandemic. And that's why lots of us who had expected to spend all of last year working on COP had to kind of pivot our attention and move towards lots of different work. So for example, in Christian Aid and SCCS, we worked on just and green recovery. And in Christian Aid, we also ran a campaign and are still running a campaign about debt cancellation, again linked to COVID. So it just means that when we're designing our activities or our engagement around COP, we have to remind ourselves that public engagement or public awareness or interest in what we're doing is in a very different space, and to really be sensitive to just how much people's circumstances and their personally and in their communities have changed as a result of the pandemic. A little bit about the last COP that took place, the one that I was able to be at. So this was seen as being quite a big COP in terms of ambition, because countries were expected to revisit their climate pledges, which we call NDCs, stands for Nationally Determined Contributions, and that's what they pledge to reduce their emissions by. So they were meant to revisit those pledges that they made in Paris that were expected to keep us within under 2 degrees of warming. But in Madrid, we saw kind of countries such as China and Brazil opposing this. They didn't want countries to be obliged to submit enhanced pledges, and they argued that it should be up to individual countries to decide. And instead, they argued that the focus should be on action in the lead up to COP26 by developing countries to meet their previous pledges. So there became a very big divide between kind of global north and global south countries around this. And then tensions grew during the conference as this kind of lack of able to reach a compromise went on. And it basically led to very weak language being included in the final declaration that came out of COP. There was also the fact that COP was meant to happen in Chile, and then it was political unrest that led to that not being able to happen, and that really impacted how civil society could engage with COP. So civil society globally was ready to travel to Chile. When it moved to Madrid, the kind of costs associated with them taking part meant that a lot of the global south wasn't represented in Madrid. The fact that it was a really long COP, so it went on for several days more than it was meant to. Global South delegates had already booked their flights back, and they couldn't necessarily afford to change that, so they weren't there for the end. And in general, there was a sense that the outcome was pretty weak, and that has left the UK government, who are hosting the next COP, basically it puts pressure on them to ensure that there's much stronger outcomes this time. And depressingly, the current commitments that we have would only keep us within 3 degrees, and it's, yeah, previously the Paris talks say that we should be aiming for 1.5. So quite a difficult COP, but there were some small victories and highlights as well. So throughout COP, there was, again, some challenges from certain countries around language in a gender action plan. They didn't want to include some of this language, but it was passed in the end. And similarly, some work with Indigenous people whose voices are very strong at COP was also agreed. And in general, it was a really good way for civil society to hand over. So from kind of grassroots and community groups in Chile who'd been organising to those in Madrid, and then on to us in Scotland. So it was a really nice way to be able to do that. Moving on to some of the work in Scotland that we're doing around COP, I thought it would be helpful to share a little bit about the work and some of the political asks of 3 groups. So I'm going to talk briefly about Stop Climate Chaos, about something called the UK COP Coalition, and a little bit about Christian Aid as well. But I think it's helpful to remind ourselves of the political situation that COP's happening in, the kind of constitutional context. So we have a devolved Scottish Government, which has responsibility for setting its own climate policy. The Scottish Climate Change Act, which was passed in September 2019, has stronger legislation in the UK. So we've got a net zero emissions by 2045 target, which is currently 5 years ahead of the UK, and 75% reductions by 2030. So understandably, it's led to some tensions between the UK and the Scottish governments, with the UK government as the official hosts and Scotland, the Scottish government technically not having a seat at the official talks. The Scottish government are obviously keen to platform and talk about their progressive climate targets on a global stage. And this also understandably has made the UK government nervous, particularly in terms of increasing public support for independence. And originally COP was going to be happening around the proposed time of a potential independence referendum, which obviously isn't happening now, but that's still added to these tensions and the way that COP is being organised. And in terms of the civil society scene in Scotland, so climate advocacy work tends to be conducted through Stop Climate Chaos Scotland, and that's a coalition of over 50 organisations, including faith groups and faith-based international development organisations such as Christian Aid, but also churches, Church of Scotland and others are members. There are kind of big environmental NGOs like WWF, Friends of the Earth. But more recently, and particularly since COP was announced as being in Scotland, we've been able to have a much broader and diverse membership because people are really interested in joining our work around COP. So we now have more trade unions, smaller community groups, racial justice groups, for example, and grassroots organisations as well. Since last year, we've agreed some of our priorities for COP, and we've also, in December, with a year to go to COP, November, sorry, we launched our asks of the Scottish Government alongside some UK asks and international asks as well. So this is our key priorities that we have for our work around COP. Within these, we have, there will be specific kind of advocacy moments where we will be having asks of the Scottish Government. But we also will have work and activities throughout the year to engage our membership and to encourage people to take part. And that's the work that I do with the public campaigns group. So we'll be designing ways in which we can offer trainings or skills building sessions to our membership who want to take part in some of our activities, but also specific actions that people can be taking in their communities as well. When COP was announced as taking place in Glasgow, conversations began to happen immediately between civil society in the rest of the UK and in Scotland, very much aware of the fact that we need to be cooperating to ensure that our engagement in COP is successful. And we also realised straight away that we needed to be much broader as a coalition. So for example, including groups such as XR or the Fuel Strikers and other grassroots groups, and with strong links to frontline and climate impacted groups in the Global South. So as a result of this, a new coalition emerged towards the end of 2019 called the COP26 UK Coalition to bring together all of these groups. And it has been meeting since then. It has a number of working groups working on a huge range of issues. And it's organised some online events, the most recent one being called From the Ground Up, which was a global gathering of climate justice activists. So it's been a really good way to kind of broaden our engagement, working with different people on COP as well. SCCS has taken a lead on the logistics working group. So that's very much about hospitality, about how we welcome global civil society to Glasgow and to Scotland. And part of this has been setting up something called the Climate Fringe website, which you might have heard of. And that's a kind of hub, digital hub for resources about COP, for events that are happening around COP. Anyone can upload an event to there, so you could share the events that you're doing on there to try and bring others to that as well. But it was also set up to be a way for people to coordinate hospitality and accommodation, and churches and interfaith groups have been really involved in this element of COP as well. And one other thing that this group does is planning to provide a space for something called the People Summit. And in that very complicated diagram I showed you earlier, that's essentially a kind of space that springs up around COP for all of civil society and local people to engage in. And it's called various things: Civil Society Summit, People Summit, Social Summit, but it's basically a huge range of events and activities and celebrations of local culture and tradition that happens around COP. And the final way to get involved to outline to you is some of the work that Christian Aid specifically has been doing. And in terms of churches and faith-based organisations in Scotland, there have been two key coordinating groups that have emerged. So one is a Glasgow Churches COP group, and the other is an Interfaith Scotland COP group, and both have been operating for about a year now to kind of bring together churches and then interfaith groups in the lead up to COP and also during COP. They're well connected and resourced, and some of the people on them and the organisations have worked together for many years, and I think provide a really strong foundation for engagement both before and during COP as well. But in terms of Christian Aid's work, a lot of what we do is kind of higher level advocacy and action. So there are plans for a similar event to Paris. So there was a kind of high level faith event with various speakers and representatives from COP as well. And for example, an ecumenical service always takes place at COP as well. And some of the other items highlighted here, the ACT Alliance, that's the international network that Christian Aid operates through. So they do the direct advocacy at COP, so they're in the official space carrying out advocacy. So we work with them as well. And then traditionally what happens on the middle weekend of COP is a mass mobilisation, a huge march to bring together civil society from across the UK, from across the world. And I went to the one in Madrid, which was a huge event held on a Friday evening in the centre of Madrid. We had started a lot of planning towards this in Glasgow, and understandably it's unclear if this will take place and what format it will take place in. But we're still kind of working in different groups to plan for what this might look like if it does go ahead. At Christian Aid, we've also got something called a global prayer chain that has still been able to happen in spite of the pandemic. And this is a way for churches and individuals to sign up to pray for climate justice and to pray for COP. And again, we hope to have the kind of actions that people take in relation to that as part of the kind of hand-in event that happens at COP. And we've also been working with an artist to do an installation called Get Your Skates On, which is connected to some of the work we've been doing around divestment, but also connected to our work at COP as well. So that's a bit of a whistle-stop tour of COP. Hopefully gives you a kind of helpful overview of some of the different ways that you can engage in this year and some of the background to COP as well. So I'd be happy to answer any questions, but also happy to point you in the direction of further details on anything that I've covered that you might be interested in. So I'll hand back to David to coordinate that.
Thank you, Fiona.